The wind was howling like a banshee when Marcus Hayes heard those words that would haunt him forever. Sarah Chun, barely conscious, her lips blue from hypothermia, looked up at him through the blinding snow and whispered, "Leave me here to die." But Marcus had made a promise 20 years ago, and tonight, that promise would either save them both or kill them trying. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Hayes had always been a man of routine. Every morning at 5:47 a.m., he'd wake up in his small cabin nestled in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State, brew his coffee black, and check the weather forecast on his crackling radio. For the past 8 years, he'd worked as a wilderness guide, leading tourists through some of the most treacherous terrain in the Pacific Northwest. But this morning felt different. The meteorologist's voice carried an unusual urgency as static filled the airwaves. Unprecedented storm system moving in from the Pacific. Wind speeds expected to reach 80 miles per hour with near-zero visibility. All residents in mountainous regions are advised to shelter in place immediately. Marcus set down his coffee mug, the ceramic clinking against the wooden table. He'd weathered countless storms in these mountains, but something in the forecaster's tone made his stomach tighten. He walked to the window, pushing back the faded plaid curtains his late wife had sewn 15 years ago. The sky was an ominous shade of gray-green, the kind that preceded the worst storms he'd ever witnessed. His satellite phone buzzed against the kitchen counter. The caller ID showed Rescue Coordination Center. "Hayes here," he answered, already knowing what was coming. "Marcus, it's Captain Rodriguez. We've got a situation developing. Search and rescue team went out yesterday to locate 2 missing hikers near Devil's Ridge. They found one of them, but we lost radio contact with the rescue team about 3 hours ago. Last known position was Grid Square 7 Delta, approximately 15 miles northeast of your location." Marcus felt his jaw clench. Grid Square 7 Delta was some of the most unforgiving terrain in the region, a maze of deep ravines, unstable rock faces, and dense forest that could swallow a person whole. In good weather, it was challenging. In the storm that was bearing down on them, it would be a death trap. "How many people are we talking about, Captain?" 4-person rescue team, plus 1 injured hiker they were attempting to evacuate. The hiker is Dr. Sarah Chun, a biochemist from Seattle. She was hiking with her research partner when they got separated in yesterday's fog. Her partner made it out and called for help, but Dr. Chun fell approximately 30 feet into a ravine and sustained what appears to be a serious leg injury. Marcus closed his eyes, picturing the terrain. Devil's Ridge was aptly named, a series of interconnected canyons and cliff faces that had claimed more lives than any other area in his sector. The rescue team would have rappelled down to reach her, but if they'd lost communication, it meant something had gone terribly wrong. "What's the timeline looking like?" Marcus asked, though he already suspected the answer. "The storm hits full force in approximately 4 hours. After that, we won't be able to get aircraft in the area for at least 24 hours, maybe longer. Ground crews can't navigate that terrain in these conditions. You're the closest person to their last known position, and you know that area better than anyone." Marcus stared out at the darkening sky. The wind was already picking up, sending the tall pines swaying in an ominous dance. Going out there would be suicide. Staying put might mean 5 people would die. "I'll need their exact coordinates and emergency frequencies," he said finally. "Marcus, I have to ask, are you sure about this?" "The conditions are going to be, send me the coordinates, Captain." After ending the call, Marcus spent the next hour methodically preparing for what could very well be his final journey into the wilderness. He packed his emergency medical supplies, high-calorie rations for 6 people, emergency shelter materials, and enough gear to survive 3 days in sub-freezing conditions. His pack, when fully loaded, weighed nearly 80 pounds. The photograph on his mantelpiece caught his eye as he shouldered his gear. His wife Elena, taken just months before the cancer diagnosis that changed everything. She was laughing, her dark hair whipping in the mountain wind, completely alive and fearless. Elena had made him promise something during those final weeks in the hospital, something that had shaped every decision he'd made since. "Promise me. You'll never stop being the man who runs toward danger when people need help," she had whispered, her voice barely audible above the beeping machines. "That's who I fell in love with, Marcus. Don't let losing me change that part of you." He had promised, and that promise had led him to countless rescues over the past 8 years. But none had felt as dangerous as what lay ahead. The wind was already fierce when Marcus stepped outside. He had to lean forward at a 45-degree angle just to make progress toward his truck. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since morning, and the first snowflakes were beginning to fall, large, wet flakes that would soon turn into a blinding wall of white. The drive to the trailhead took nearly an hour, with Marcus fighting crosswinds that threatened to push his truck off the narrow mountain road. By the time he reached the parking area, the snow was falling steadily, and visibility had dropped to less than 50 yards. He checked his GPS one final time, memorizing the coordinates Captain Rodriguez had provided. Grid Square 7 Delta was a brutal 15-mile hike under the best conditions. In the storm that was rapidly intensifying, it might as well have been on the moon. The trail started as a well-maintained path through old-growth forest, but within the first mile, it became a barely visible track winding between massive Douglas firs and western hemlocks. Marcus had hiked this route dozens of times, but he'd never attempted it in conditions like these. The snow was falling harder now, accumulating quickly on the ground and weighing down the tree branches above. Several times he had to duck as heavy limbs, loaded with snow, crashed down across the trail. The wind was constant and brutal, a howling presence that seemed determined to knock him off his feet. 3 miles in, Marcus encountered his first real obstacle. A massive cedar tree, probably 200 years old, had been uprooted by the wind and now completely blocked the trail. The trunk was easily 4 feet in diameter, far too large to climb over, and the root system created an impenetrable barrier that extended 20 feet in each direction. He would have to go around, but that meant leaving the established trail and navigating through dense undergrowth in near-zero visibility. Marcus pulled out his compass and GPS, calculating a route that would bring him back to the trail on the other side of the fallen giant. The detour took him through a section of forest he'd never explored before. The undergrowth was thick with devil's club and salmonberry bushes, their thorns tearing at his clothing and pack. The GPS signal kept cutting in and out under the heavy canopy, forcing him to rely primarily on his compass and his knowledge of the terrain. It took him over an hour to work his way around the fallen tree and back to the main trail. By then, the snow was falling so heavily that he could barely see 10 feet ahead. His footprints from just minutes earlier were already completely filled in, erased by the relentless storm. The trail began to climb steeply as it approached the ridge system that would lead him to Grid Square 7 Delta. This was the section that separated casual hikers from serious mountaineers, a series of switchbacks that gained over 2,000 feet of elevation in less than 2 miles. Under normal conditions, it was a challenging but manageable climb. Tonight, with hurricane-force winds and blinding snow, every step was a battle. Marcus found himself using his ice axe as much for balance as for cutting steps in the increasingly icy trail. The wind was particularly vicious on the exposed sections of the climb. Several times, sudden gusts literally lifted him off his feet, and he had to use his axe to arrest what could have been fatal falls. The storm wasn't just weather anymore. It was a living, malevolent force that seemed personally committed to stopping him. About halfway up the steepest section, Marcus heard something that made his blood run cold. Through the howling wind came the unmistakable sound of a tree falling, but this wasn't just any tree. The groaning, cracking sound went on for nearly 30 seconds, the death cry of one of the forest giants. The crash, when it came, shook the ground beneath his feet. He couldn't see where it had fallen, but the sound had come from somewhere ahead, possibly across the trail he needed to follow. Marcus pressed on, each step becoming more difficult as the snow accumulated. His pack, already heavy, was collecting. Snow and ice, adding to the burden. His core temperature was holding steady for now, but he could feel the cold starting to creep into his extremities. Despite his heavy gloves and insulated boots, the GPS showed he was still 8 miles from the rescue team's last known position. At his current pace, fighting through the storm, it would take him at least 4 more hours to reach them. By then, the storm would be at full intensity, and the return journey would be even more treacherous. As he crested a particularly steep section of trail, Marcus was hit by a wall of wind so powerful that it drove him to his knees. The snow was now falling horizontally, stinging his exposed face like thousands of tiny needles. He pulled his balaclava higher and adjusted his goggles, but the storm seemed to find every gap in his protection. The trail ahead disappeared into a white void. He could barely make out the shapes of trees on either side, and the path itself was indistinguishable from the surrounding forest floor. Navigation was now purely a matter of GPS coordinates and compass bearings, with occasional reference to major landmarks when visibility allowed. Marcus paused to check his position and was alarmed to discover that his GPS was showing significant drift. The heavy cloud cover and electrical activity in the storm were interfering with the satellite signal, making his readings unreliable. He would have to rely increasingly on dead reckoning and his intimate knowledge of these mountains. The sound that had been nagging at the edge of his consciousness suddenly became clear. It wasn't just wind. Somewhere ahead, barely audible above the storm, someone was calling for help. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus stopped completely, straining to hear above the howling wind. There it was again. A human voice, distant and desperate, carrying on the wind from somewhere ahead and to his left. It was impossible to tell how far away, but it was definitely coming from the direction of Grid Square 7 Delta. He increased his pace, pushing through snow that was now knee-deep in places. The voice came again, clearer this time. It was a woman's voice, and she was calling the same word over and over: help. The terrain was becoming increasingly treacherous as he moved off the established trail toward the sound. This section of the mountains was riddled with hidden ravines and unstable rock formations, all now concealed beneath a deceptive blanket of snow. Marcus tested each step carefully with his ice axe before committing his full weight. Twice, he broke through what appeared to be solid ground into hidden crevices that could have resulted in serious injury. The storm was turning the familiar landscape into an alien world full of invisible dangers. The voice was getting closer, but it was also getting weaker. Whoever was calling was running out of strength, and Marcus knew he was racing against more than just the weather now. As he worked his way down a steep slope toward what his GPS indicated was the upper edge of Grid Square 7 Delta, the full fury of the storm hit. The wind reached a sustained roar that made communication impossible, and the snow was falling so heavily that Marcus couldn't see his own feet. This was the point of no return. If he continued forward, there would be no going back until the storm passed. The terrain ahead was too dangerous to navigate in the dark, even with his headlamp, and the weather would only get worse. But the voice was still calling, fainter now but persistent. Someone was alive out there, probably injured, definitely in mortal danger. Marcus thought of Elena's words, of the promise he'd made, and of the 5 people who were depending on him to find them. before it was too late. He adjusted his pack, checked his compass bearing one more time, and stepped forward into the white void, not knowing that his decision in that moment would test every limit of human endurance and force him to carry more than just physical weight through the longest night of his life. The voice led Marcus through a maze of snow-covered boulders and twisted pine trees, each step taking him deeper into terrain that seemed designed to kill. His headlamp beam barely penetrated the swirling snow, creating a claustrophobic tunnel of light that revealed dangers only seconds before he encountered them. The calls for help had stopped 20 minutes ago. Marcus pressed forward, following his GPS coordinates and the fading impressions in the snow that might have been footprints. The silence was somehow more terrifying than the cries had been. Either whoever was calling had found shelter, or they had succumbed to the storm. A sudden crack beneath his feet made him freeze. He was standing on what appeared to be solid ground, but the sound suggested something hollow underneath. Marcus carefully backed away and used his ice axe to probe the area ahead. The tool punched through what looked like snow-covered earth, revealing empty space below. He had nearly walked into a hidden ravine. Moving to his right, Marcus found more stable ground and continued his descent. The GPS showed he was now within half a mile of the rescue team's last known position, but the terrain was becoming increasingly vertical. Soon he would need to start rappelling, and in these conditions, that was almost a death sentence. The wind suddenly shifted, and in that brief moment of relative calm, Marcus heard something that made his heart race, the distinctive sound of metal striking rock, rhythmic and deliberate. Someone was still alive down there, and they were trying to signal for help. Following the sound, Marcus worked his way to the edge of what appeared to be a steep slope. He couldn't see the bottom through the snow and darkness, but the metallic tapping was definitely coming from below. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted as loud as he could manage, "Hello, can you hear me?" The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was only the howling wind. Then, faintly but unmistakably, came a response. "Here, we're down here. 3 of us left." Marcus felt a surge of relief mixed with dread. 3 survivors meant at least 2 people hadn't made it. The rescue team of 4, plus the injured hiker, had been reduced to 3 souls clinging to life. Somewhere in the darkness below, he secured his climbing rope to the largest tree he could find, and began preparing for what would be the most dangerous rappel of his career. The wind was so strong that it threatened to slam him into the rock face, and the rope was already accumulating ice that would make it treacherous to handle. The descent was a nightmare of spinning, wind-battered chaos. Marcus couldn't control his rate of descent properly because the gusting wind kept lifting him away from the rock face, then slamming him back against it. By the time his feet touched solid ground, his ribs were bruised and his hands were nearly frozen despite his heavy gloves. He found himself in a narrow canyon, protected somewhat from the direct force of the wind, but filled with swirling snow that seemed to come from every direction at once. His headlamp beam swept across the area, searching for signs of life. "Over here." The voice came from a cluster of large boulders about 50 yards away. Marcus worked his way toward the sound, his boots crunching through snow that was waist-deep in places. As he got closer, he could see the orange fabric of an emergency shelter stretched between 2 rocks, barely holding against the wind. Inside the makeshift shelter, he found them. Tom Rodriguez, a veteran search and rescue technician, was conscious, but clearly hypothermic, his speech slurred and his movements sluggish. Jessica Martinez, the team medic, was in worse shape, semi-conscious, and showing signs of severe frostbite on her hands and feet. Between them, wrapped in every piece of spare clothing they had, was Dr. Sarah Chun. Sarah was conscious, but barely responsive. Her left leg was obviously broken, bent at an unnatural angle and splinted with pieces of climbing equipment. But it was her core temperature that worried Marcus most. Even bundled in multiple layers, she was shivering violently. Her body's last-ditch effort to generate warmth before hypothermia shut down her vital organs. "Thank God you made it," Tom managed through chattering teeth. "Lost Rodriguez and Patterson 6 hours ago. Avalanche took them when we were trying to set up a proper shelter. Been trying to keep Dr. Chun alive, but he didn't need to finish." Marcus could see the situation was desperate. Without immediate medical attention and evacuation to a heated shelter, all 3 of them would be dead before morning. "What happened to your radio equipment?" Marcus asked as he began unpacking his. "Medical supplies. Buried under about 10 tons of snow and rock," Jessica whispered. "Everything we had for emergency communication is gone. Been using my ice axe against the rocks, hoping someone would hear." Marcus quickly assessed their conditions. Tom was in the best shape of the 3, still able to move and think relatively clearly. Jessica was suffering from moderate to severe hypothermia and frostbite, but she was stable for now. Sarah was the most critical. Her broken leg was the least of her problems. Her core temperature had dropped dangerously low, and she was showing signs of confusion and disorientation that indicated her brain wasn't getting enough oxygen. "We need to get you all out of here, but I can't carry 3 people," Marcus said bluntly. "The storm is getting worse, and we've got a 15-mile hike back to the trailhead." "Leave me," Sarah said suddenly, her voice barely audible. "I'm slowing everyone down. My leg. I can't walk. Just leave me here." "That's not happening," Marcus replied firmly. "We're all getting out of here." But even as he said it, he knew the mathematics of survival were working against them. Tom might be able to walk with assistance, and Jessica could probably manage the journey if they moved slowly. But Sarah, with her broken leg and advanced hypothermia, would need to be carried. In normal conditions, that would be challenging but possible. In the storm that was raging above them, it seemed impossible. Marcus spent the next hour doing everything he could to stabilize their conditions. He used his portable camp stove to heat water for warm drinks, redistributed clothing and insulation to maximize warmth retention, and administered what medical care he could with his limited supplies. The most critical issue was Sarah's hypothermia. Her core temperature was so low that rewarming her too quickly could cause cardiac arrest, but leaving her as she was would certainly result in death. Marcus carefully began the process of gradual rewarming, using heated water bottles and shared body heat while monitoring her vital signs. "She's not going to make it," Jessica whispered when Sarah appeared to lose consciousness again. "Even if we could carry her, she won't survive the cold exposure during the hike out." Marcus checked Sarah's pulse, weak and irregular, but still there. Her breathing was shallow and her skin had taken on a grayish color that he recognized from other hypothermia cases. Jessica was right. Sarah was dying, and their situation was becoming more hopeless by the hour. The wind above them was reaching a sustained roar that made conversation nearly impossible. Snow was finding its way into their shelter despite their best efforts, and the temperature was continuing to drop. Marcus's thermometer read -8 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was in their relatively protected position. On the exposed ridge above, it would be at least 20 degrees colder with the wind chill. "I've been thinking about the route out," Tom said during a brief lull in the wind. "Even if we could get back to the main trail, half of it's probably blocked by now. Trees coming down, avalanche danger in the open areas. It's not just about carrying Sarah. It's about whether any of us can survive the journey." Marcus knew Tom was right. The storm had transformed familiar terrain into a death trap. The route he had used to reach them was already compromised. The rappelling anchor above could fail at any moment, and climbing back up in these conditions would be nearly impossible. But there was another way out. Marcus pulled out his topographic map, studying it by headlamp while the others huddled together for warmth. Devil's Canyon had multiple exits, but most were technical climbing routes, that would be impossible in current conditions. However, there was one possibility, a route that followed the canyon floor northeast for about 3 miles before climbing, out through a series of natural shelves that offered some protection from the wind. "There's another way," he said, pointing to the map. "Canyon route. It's longer, but it might be more protected from the storm." Tom studied the map, his face grim. "That route comes out near Glacier Point. That's still 12 miles from the trailhead, and it's all exposed ridge walking. But it's 12 miles where we're not fighting the wind the whole way," Marcus countered. "And there are several emergency shelters along that route. We could rest, warm up, maybe wait for the worst of the storm to pass." "With Sarah in her condition?" Jessica shook her head. "She needs a hospital, not another night in the mountains." Marcus looked at Sarah, who was shivering less violently now, a bad sign that meant her body was giving up the fight to generate heat. They had maybe 6 hours before hypothermia shut down her vital organs completely. 6 hours to cover what would normally be a full day's hike in perfect conditions. "We're going to try," Marcus said finally. "I'll carry Sarah. Tom, can you manage?" "On your own?" "I'll make it," Tom replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Jessica, you'll need to stay close. If your frostbite gets worse, you could lose fingers or toes." "Better than losing my life," she replied. Marcus began repacking their supplies, consolidating everything into 2 packs, one for him to carry along with Sarah, and one for Tom. They would leave behind anything non-essential, but they still needed shelter materials, medical supplies, and enough food and water for the journey. The hardest part was figuring out how to carry Sarah. She was unconscious now, which made her dead weight, but it also meant she wouldn't be able to help balance or hold on during the most difficult sections. Marcus fashioned a carrying system using climbing rope and webbing that would distribute her weight across his back and shoulders, but he knew it would be brutally exhausting. As they prepared to leave their shelter, Sarah's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she seemed aware of her surroundings. "Don't," she whispered, looking directly at Marcus. "Don't die trying to save me. I'm already gone." "No, you're not," Marcus replied, adjusting the carrying harness. "I made a promise a long time ago, and I'm keeping it tonight." Sarah's eyes closed again, but not before Marcus saw something in them, not resignation, but a flicker of hope. It was enough to fuel his determination for what lay ahead. The canyon floor was treacherous, filled with hidden obstacles and unstable footing, but it was their only chance. As they began the most dangerous journey of their lives, Marcus knew that every step forward was a victory against odds that seemed designed to defeat them. Behind them, the temporary shelter collapsed under the weight of snow and wind, erasing the last trace of their presence in the narrow canyon where 2 good people had already lost their lives to the storm. Ahead lay 12 miles of the most unforgiving terrain in North America, and a woman whose life hung by a thread that grew thinner with every passing minute. The canyon floor was a maze of ice-covered rocks and hidden sinkholes that tested every step. Marcus had been carrying Sarah for 47 minutes, and already his legs were screaming in protest. The makeshift harness cut into his shoulders, and Sarah's unconscious weight shifted unpredictably with each movement, throwing off his balance. On the treacherous footing, Tom struggled along behind them, using his ice axe as a walking stick. His hypothermia was making him clumsy, and twice he had fallen hard on the uneven ground. Jessica brought up the rear, moving slowly but steadily, her frostbitten hands making it difficult to use her own walking aids effectively. The canyon walls rose steeply on both sides, offering some protection from the direct force of the wind, but creating a wind tunnel effect that sent snow swirling in chaotic patterns. The temperature had dropped to -12 degrees, and Marcus could feel the cold creeping through his multiple layers of insulation. How much further to the first shelter? Tom called out, his voice barely audible above the wind. Marcus consulted his GPS, struggling to read the screen through the condensation that kept forming on the inside of his goggles. 2.5 miles, but we're moving slower than I hoped. They were averaging less than 1 mile per hour. At this pace, it would take them over 12 hours to reach safety, assuming they could maintain their current speed. Sarah didn't have 12 hours. The canyon began to narrow, forcing them to navigate through a section where the walls closed in to barely 15 feet apart. Here, the wind created a Venturi effect that nearly knocked Marcus off his feet several times. Worse, the narrow passage was filled with loose rock that had been frozen in place by ice, creating an unstable walking surface. Marcus tested each step carefully, knowing that a fall here could injure not only himself but Sarah as well. The extra weight on his back made every movement deliberate and exhausting. His core temperature was holding steady for now, but he was burning calories at an unsustainable rate. Jessica suddenly stumbled and went down hard, crying out as she landed on her damaged hands. Marcus carefully lowered Sarah to a protected area between 2 boulders and went back to help. "I can't feel my fingers anymore," Jessica gasped, tears freezing on her cheeks. "The frostbite is getting worse." Marcus examined her hands by headlamp. The frostbite had progressed significantly since they'd left the shelter. Several of her fingertips were now completely white and hard to the touch, a sign that the tissue was dying. Without immediate medical intervention, she would lose parts of multiple fingers. "We need to rewarm them," Marcus said, pulling chemical heat packs from his medical kit. "This is going to hurt." The process of rewarming frostbitten tissue was excruciating, and Jessica bit down on a piece of cloth to keep from screaming. Marcus worked quickly, knowing they couldn't afford to stop for long. Every minute of delay brought Sarah closer to irreversible hypothermia. While he worked on Jessica's hands, Tom had been scouting ahead through the narrow section. He returned with disturbing news. "There's a problem about 200 yards ahead," he reported. "The canyon floor is completely flooded. Must be a spring that's kept flowing despite the cold. The water looks deep, and there's no way around it." Marcus felt his stomach drop. Crossing deep water in these temperatures would be fatal for anyone who fell in. For Sarah, who was already hypothermic, even minimal water exposure could kill her within minutes. "How deep are we talking?" Marcus asked. "Hard to tell in this light, but it's flowing fast and I couldn't see the bottom. Maybe waist deep, maybe deeper." Marcus closed his eyes, running through their limited options. They could backtrack and try to find another route, but that would add hours to their journey, and Sarah was already running out of time. They could attempt to traverse around the flooded area by climbing the canyon walls, but that would require technical rock climbing in impossible conditions. Or they could try to cross the water and hope for the best. There might be another option. Jessica said weakly, "Emergency protocols. If we can get Sarah across that water safely, I have medication in my kit that could buy us more time." "What kind of medication?" "Epinephrine. It won't cure hypothermia, but it might stimulate her heart enough to keep her alive longer. It's risky, could cause cardiac arrest if her core temperature is too low, but at this point..." Marcus understood. They were rapidly approaching the point where any risk was worth taking. They resumed their journey through the narrow section, with Marcus carrying Sarah and Tom helping Jessica navigate the increasingly difficult terrain. The sound of running water grew louder as they approached the flooded area, and Marcus could see his breath forming ice crystals in the frigid air. The flooded section was worse than Tom had described. The water extended across the entire width of the canyon for at least 50 yards, and it was flowing fast enough to knock a person down. Worse, there were chunks of ice floating in the current that would make crossing even more dangerous. Marcus carefully lowered Sarah to the ground and began preparing for what might be the most dangerous part of their journey. He secured his climbing rope to a sturdy boulder and tested the water depth with his ice axe. The tool disappeared completely before hitting bottom. "It's over my head in the middle," he reported grimly. "We're going to have to swim part of it. In this temperature?" Tom shook his head. "That's suicide." "Staying here is suicide too," Marcus replied. "Sarah's got maybe an hour left. We have to try." He began stripping off his outer layers, knowing that wet insulation would be worse than no insulation at all. The plan was simple but terrifying. He would carry Sarah across on his back, using the rope as a safety line. If they went under, Tom and Jessica would pull them out. "Wait," Jessica said, struggling with her damaged pack. "Give me 2 minutes." She pulled out a compact emergency shelter, an ultralight bivy designed for one person. "We can seal Sarah inside this. It's waterproof. If you go under, she'll stay dry." It was a brilliant solution, but it meant Marcus would be swimming in near-freezing water while carrying an unconscious person sealed in a waterproof bag. The physical challenge was enormous, and the margin for error was zero. They worked quickly to seal Sarah inside the emergency bivy, leaving only a small opening for air. She was completely unconscious now, her breathing so shallow that Marcus had to put his ear to her chest to confirm she was still alive. "If something goes wrong," Marcus told Tom and Jessica, "don't try to save me. Get yourselves out and send help for Sarah." "Marcus, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." He secured the rope around his waist and entered the water. The cold was like being stabbed with thousands of ice picks simultaneously. Marcus gasped involuntarily, nearly inhaling water as the current tried to sweep him downstream. The bottom was slick with algae and loose rocks that shifted under his feet. For the first 20 yards, he could touch bottom and maintain some control. Sarah's sealed form on his back felt impossibly heavy, but the waterproof shelter was keeping her dry. The current was strong, but manageable. Then the bottom dropped away completely. Marcus found himself swimming in water so cold it felt like liquid nitrogen. His muscles began cramping immediately, and his coordination started deteriorating as his core temperature plummeted. The current was much stronger in the deep section, carrying him downstream faster than he could swim forward. He could hear Tom and Jessica shouting encouragement, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. His vision began to tunnel, and he realized he was experiencing the early stages of cold water shock. The rope around his waist suddenly went taut, and Marcus felt himself being pulled back toward the crossing point. Tom and Jessica were using their combined strength to fight the current, keeping him from being swept away completely. With desperate strokes, Marcus fought his way toward the far shore. His arms felt like lead weights, and he could no longer feel his legs, but somehow he kept moving. The waterproof shelter containing Sarah scraped against floating ice chunks, but it held. His feet touched bottom again, just as his strength gave out completely. Marcus crawled the final 10 yards to shore, dragging Sarah behind him, his body shaking uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. Tom and Jessica crossed using a different technique. Tom went first, then secured the rope from the far side while Jessica followed. Both of them ended up partially submerged, but they made it across with less exposure to the deep water. On the far shore, Marcus was in serious trouble. His core temperature had dropped dangerously during the crossing, and he was showing signs of severe hypothermia. His speech was slurred, his movements were uncoordinated, and he was becoming confused and disoriented. "We need to get him rewarmed now," Jessica said, fighting through her own hypothermia to think clearly. "If we lose Marcus, we're all dead." They quickly set up their emergency shelter in a protected area and began the process of rewarming both Marcus and Sarah. It was a desperate balance. They needed to warm Marcus enough to continue functioning, but they couldn't use all their heat sources or Sarah would continue deteriorating. Jessica administered the epinephrine injection to Sarah, and within minutes they could see a slight improvement in her vital signs. Her breathing became more regular, and her pulse strengthened slightly. It wasn't a cure, but it bought them precious time. Marcus gradually regained enough function to continue, though he was operating at significantly reduced capacity. The water crossing had taken a severe toll on all of them, but they had made it through the most dangerous obstacle so far. "How much further to the emergency shelter?" Tom asked, checking his watch. They had been traveling for over 3 hours and had covered less than 4 miles. 6 miles, Marcus replied, his voice still shaky from the hypothermia. "But it's uphill from here." We start climbing out of the canyon. The route ahead led up a series of natural rock shelves that formed a giant staircase out of the canyon floor. Under normal conditions, it would be a moderate climb. In their current state, carrying an unconscious person would test every limit of human endurance, but they had come too far to quit now. Marcus adjusted Sarah's position in the carrying harness, ignoring the sharp pain in his shoulders and back. Tom and Jessica prepared for the climb, both of them moving with the slow, deliberate motions of people operating on the edge of their physical capabilities. The first shelf was only 8 feet high, but it required technical climbing skills to navigate safely. Marcus had to carefully plan each handhold and foothold, knowing that a fall would likely kill both him and Sarah. Tom and Jessica followed. Using the rope Marcus left in place. As they climbed higher, the wind exposure increased dramatically. They were climbing out of the protected canyon into the full fury of the storm, and each level brought more brutal conditions. Snow was falling so heavily that visibility dropped to mere feet, and the wind was strong enough to make climbing extremely dangerous. But with each shelf they conquered, they were getting closer to safety. The emergency shelter was still hours away, but it was no longer an impossible dream. It was a destination they might actually reach, if they could maintain their pace and avoid any more catastrophic obstacles. Sarah stirred slightly as they reached the 3rd shelf, the first sign of consciousness she had shown in hours. Her eyes opened briefly, and she looked directly at Marcus. "Still here," she whispered, so quietly he almost didn't hear her above the wind. "Still here," Marcus confirmed, adjusting his grip and preparing for the next section of the climb that would either bring them closer to salvation or push them beyond the limits of human survival. The 7th rock shelf nearly broke them. Marcus had been climbing for 2 hours since the water crossing, his shoulders screaming in agony from Sarah's weight. Each shelf required him to essentially do a technical rock climb while carrying another human being, and his strength was failing fast. Tom and Jessica followed behind, both moving like automatons, their bodies running on willpower alone. This shelf was different from the others. Where the previous climbs had been 8 to 12 feet of relatively straightforward rock work, this one stretched nearly 30 feet up a nearly vertical granite face, with handholds that were little more than shallow cracks in the stone. "I can't do it," Marcus said, the first time he had admitted defeat since the rescue began. "Not with Sarah, it's too technical." Tom studied the rock face through his fogged goggles. "Maybe we can find another route, go around somehow." But their GPS showed they were boxed in. The canyon walls extended for miles in either direction, and this shelf system was the only viable way out. To go around would mean backtracking hours through terrain they had already crossed, and none of them had the strength for that. "There might be a way," Jessica said weakly, "but you're not going to like it." She pointed to a section of the rock face where wind and water erosion had created a narrow chimney, a vertical crack just wide enough for a person to climb by, wedging their back against one wall and their feet against the other. "I could go up first, set up a pulley system with the rope. You could haul Sarah up separately, then climb yourself." Marcus looked at the chimney climb. It was technically possible, but Jessica was suffering from severe frostbite and hypothermia. The climb would require precise hand and foot placement, and one mistake would mean a fatal fall. "You can barely feel your hands," Marcus pointed out. "I can feel them enough," Jessica replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "It's either that or we all die down here." The wind was getting stronger as they stood there debating. Snow was accumulating on the rock face, making climbing even more treacherous. They were burning daylight and calories they couldn't afford to lose. "I'll do it," Tom said suddenly. "I'm in better shape than Jessica right now." "Tom, you're hypothermic too. Your judgment is compromised. So is yours. So is everyone's. But somebody has to make this climb, and I'm the lightest. Less likely to pull the anchor points out." Marcus realized Tom was right. In their current condition, none of them were capable of making perfect decisions, but they had to make a decision. Standing in the wind and cold was killing them. Slowly, Tom began preparing for the climb, checking his gear with movements that were slow but methodical. The chimney route was terrifying. If he slipped, there would be no way to arrest his fall. But it was their only option. "If I don't make it," Tom said, adjusting his harness, "take the emergency beacon from my pack. Activate it, and wait for rescue. Don't try to carry Sarah any further." "Tom, promise me, Marcus, don't let my death be meaningless." Marcus nodded, though he had no intention of keeping that promise. He had come too far to abandon Sarah. Now Tom began the chimney climb with painful deliberation. Each movement was calculated, tested, then committed to. The technique required him to maintain constant pressure between his back and feet, essentially walking up the narrow crack through pure muscle tension. 15 feet up, disaster nearly struck. Tom's foot slipped on a patch of ice, and for a terrifying moment he was hanging by his fingertips alone. Marcus could hear him breathing hard, fighting panic as he struggled to regain his footing. "Take your time," Marcus called up. "We're not going anywhere." Tom managed to get his feet back in position and continued climbing. 20 feet, 25. The final 5 feet were the worst. The chimney widened slightly, making the technique less effective and requiring more upper body strength, but Tom made it. His shout of triumph echoed off the canyon walls as he reached the top of the shelf and began setting up the rope system that would allow them to haul Sarah up. The pulley system worked, but barely. It took all three of them, Tom pulling from above, Marcus and Jessica managing the rope from below, to lift Sarah's unconscious form 30 feet up the rock face. Twice the system jammed, and Marcus had to climb partway up to free the rope. When it was Marcus's turn to climb, he discovered that his earlier hypothermia had affected his coordination more than he realized. Handholds that should have been routine felt uncertain, and his legs shook with fatigue on moves that normally would have been easy. Halfway up the face, his left hand slipped. Marcus swung sideways, slamming into the rock wall with enough force to knock the wind out of him. For a moment, he hung there stunned before fighting to regain his grip. The near fall had wasted precious energy and shaken his confidence. Jessica's climb was the most terrifying of all. Her frostbitten hands made gripping the rope extremely difficult, and twice she had to stop and rest on small ledges, her strength completely exhausted. Tom and Marcus hauled her up the final 10 feet when she could no longer climb under her own power. By the time all four of them were on the 7th shelf, they had been climbing for nearly 4 hours. The emergency shelter was still 3 miles away, but they were finally out of the canyon and on more familiar terrain. The problem was that familiar terrain meant exposure to the full fury of the storm. The wind hit them like a physical blow as they emerged from the relative protection of the canyon walls. Sustained gusts of over 60 miles per hour drove snow horizontally across the mountainside, creating whiteout conditions that made navigation nearly impossible. Marcus tried to check his GPS, but the device had finally succumbed to the cold and moisture. The screen was black, completely unresponsive. Their backup navigation was a simple compass, and Marcus's knowledge of the terrain, both of which were severely compromised by the storm conditions. Which direction? Tom shouted over the wind. Marcus consulted his compass, trying to remember the bearing to the emergency shelter. But the storm was disorienting, and after hours of technical climbing and near-death experiences, his mental map of the area was becoming unreliable. He picked a direction that felt right and started walking, carrying Sarah in a modified fireman's carry that distributed her weight differently. The new position was slightly easier on his shoulders, but it made walking on uneven terrain much more difficult. They had been walking for 20 minutes when Marcus realized they were going the wrong direction. The terrain was becoming steeper and more technical, leading them toward some of the most dangerous climbing areas in the region. The emergency shelter was located on a gentle saddle between two peaks, not in the technical alpine zone they were approaching. "We're lost," he admitted, stopping the group behind a large boulder that offered minimal wind protection. "How lost?" Jessica asked. Marcus tried to think through their route, but exhaustion and hypothermia were making it difficult to concentrate. "I'm not sure. Maybe half a mile off course, maybe more." "We don't have time to backtrack," Tom pointed out. "Sarah's been unconscious for over an hour again. The epinephrine is wearing off." Marcus checked Sarah's pulse and was alarmed by what he found. Her heart rate was becoming irregular, and her breathing was so shallow it was barely detectable. The brief improvement from Jessica's injection had faded, and she was once again slipping away. "We need shelter now," Marcus said. "Not the emergency hut, just somewhere to get out of this wind and try to rewarm her." They began searching desperately for any kind of natural shelter. A cave, an overhang, even a dense stand of trees that might break the wind. But this section of the mountain was exposed granite and scattered boulders, offering little protection from the elements. Tom found it first, a narrow crevice between two massive granite slabs that created a wind-protected space just large enough for 4 people. It wasn't warm, but it was out of the direct blast of the storm. They crowded into the tiny space, immediately beginning the process of trying to rewarm Sarah with their own body heat. Marcus pulled off his outer jacket and wrapped it around her, despite knowing that losing insulation might cost him his own life. "She's not responding," Jessica said after checking Sarah's vital signs. "Her core temperature is too low. Even if we could get her completely warm, she might have suffered irreversible damage." Marcus looked at Sarah's still form, remembering her earlier words, "Leave me here to die." Maybe she had been right. Maybe trying to save her was just condemning them all to death in this frozen wasteland. But then he thought of Elena, dying in that sterile hospital room, making him promise to never stop being the man who ran toward danger when people needed help. Sarah was still breathing. Her heart was still beating. As long as there was life, there was hope. "We keep going," Marcus said firmly. "All of us." "Marcus, be realistic." "No." His voice carried a finality that ended the discussion. "We didn't come this far to give up now. Sarah's tough. She's a scientist. She understands survival. She's fighting, and so are we." As if responding to his words, Sarah's eyes fluttered open. For just a moment, she was conscious and aware. "Cold," she whispered, the single word taking enormous effort. "I know," Marcus replied, adjusting the insulation around her. "But we're going to get you warm. We're going to get you home." Sarah's eyes focused on him with surprising clarity. "Why?" she asked. "Why risk everything for someone you don't even know?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking of Elena, of promises made and kept, of the choice between safety and doing what was right, because that's what people do, he said finally. "When someone needs help, you help them, no matter what it costs." Sarah's eyes closed again, but not before Marcus saw something change in her expression. It wasn't a resignation anymore. It was determination. Outside their tiny shelter, the storm continued to rage with undiminished fury. They were still miles from safety, still facing obstacles that seemed designed to defeat them. But something had changed in that moment of connection. Between Marcus and Sarah, they weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting to prove that human decency could triumph over impossible odds. that the promise to help others was worth keeping, even when it might cost everything. The hardest part of their journey was still ahead, but they would face it. Together, carrying more than just physical weight through the longest night of their lives. They couldn't stay in the crevice shelter much longer. Despite being out of the direct wind, the temperature was still dropping, and their shared body heat wasn't enough to meaningfully warm Sarah. Worse, Marcus could feel his own core temperature beginning to drop again as he gave up more and more of his insulation to keep her alive. "We need to move," he announced after checking his watch. They had been in the shelter for 43 minutes, long enough to rest slightly, but not long enough to solve any of their fundamental problems. Tom was studying the storm through the narrow opening of their shelter. "It's not getting any better out there. If anything, the wind is stronger." "Staying here is just a slow death," Marcus replied. "At least if we keep moving, we have a chance." Jessica had been trying to restore circulation to her frostbitten fingers by massaging them, but the damage was becoming more severe. "I'm having trouble with fine motor control," she admitted. "If we run into technical terrain again, I might not be able to manage it." Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. "Jessica, you stay here. Use the emergency beacon to call for rescue when the storm clears." "Absolutely not. Listen to me. You're injured and getting worse. Tom and I can move faster with just Sarah. We'll send help back for you as soon as we reach the shelter." "Marcus, that's suicide. You can't carry Sarah and navigate in these conditions without backup." "We don't have a choice. Every minute we delay, Sarah gets closer to dying. And every minute you spend in these conditions, you lose more tissue to frostbite." It was a brutal calculation, but Marcus knew it was correct. Jessica was becoming a liability, not through any fault of her own, but because her injuries were severe enough to slow the group down and compromise their chances of saving Sarah. Tom understood the mathematics of survival. "He's right, Jess. You activate the beacon and find better shelter. We'll come back for you." Jessica wanted to argue, but she could see the logic. Her frostbite was beyond field treatment now. She needed proper medical care, and she was no longer capable of the physical demands of their journey. "Take the rest of my medical supplies," she said, emptying her pack. "And Tom, take my emergency shelter. If you get caught in the open, it might save your lives." The goodbyes were brief but emotional. They all knew this might be the last time they saw each other alive. Jessica pressed the emergency beacon into Tom's hands, a backup in case Marcus's plan failed completely. Marcus adjusted Sarah's position for what felt like the 100th time, trying to find a carrying method that wouldn't completely destroy his back and shoulders. She had been unconscious for over an hour again, but her breathing seemed slightly stronger since their rest in the shelter. Tom shouldered his lightened pack and prepared for what would be the final push to safety or death. The emergency shelter was still approximately 2 miles away, but in these conditions, that might as well have been 20. They emerged from the crevice into a world of white chaos. The storm had intensified during their brief rest, and visibility was now down to less than 5 feet. The wind was a constant roar that made communication nearly impossible, and the snow was falling so heavily that it seemed solid. Marcus tried to orient himself using the compass, but the storm was so disorienting that he wasn't sure he could trust his readings. The terrain features that normally would help with navigation were completely obscured by the blowing snow. They began walking. What Marcus hoped was northeast toward the emergency shelter, but within minutes he realized they were in serious trouble. The ground beneath their feet was becoming increasingly uneven and rocky, terrain that didn't match his mental map of the route to the shelter. "We're going the wrong way again," Tom shouted over the wind. Marcus stopped, trying to think through their position. The storm was playing havoc with his navigation, and the physical exhaustion was making it difficult to concentrate. They could be anywhere within a several-mile radius of their intended route, "Do you recognize any of this terrain?" Marcus asked. Tom looked around, but the visibility was so poor that recognizing landmarks was impossible. "It all looks the same in this weather." Marcus made another difficult decision. Instead of continuing to wander potentially in circles, they would follow the fall line of the slope they were on, heading generally downhill until they found a recognizable feature or reached the valley floor. It was a risky strategy. Going downhill might take them further from the emergency shelter, but it would also lead them toward lower elevations where the storm might be less severe. And if they could reach the main valley, Marcus was confident he could navigate from there. The downhill route was treacherous. The slope was steep and covered with loose rock hidden beneath the snow. Several times, Marcus nearly lost his footing, and a fall while carrying Sarah could have been catastrophic for both of them. Tom stayed close, ready to help if Marcus stumbled, but Tom was struggling with his own balance and coordination. The hypothermia was affecting all of them now, slowing their reflexes and impairing their judgment. After an hour of careful descent, they encountered an unexpected obstacle, a cliff band that dropped away into darkness. The slope they had been following ended at what appeared to be a significant vertical drop, possibly 40 or 50 feet. "Can we get around it?" Tom asked, though the question was more hopeful than realistic. Marcus explored to the left and right, but the cliff band seemed to extend in both directions, beyond the range of their visibility. They were trapped on a ledge system with no obvious way forward. "We have to go back up," Marcus said, the words feeling like a death sentence. "Find another route." But going back up meant retracing their steps over terrain that had been difficult enough to descend. With their energy reserves nearly exhausted, climbing back up that slope while carrying Sarah seemed impossible. That's when Tom made a discovery that changed everything. While Marcus was evaluating their options, Tom had been exploring the cliff edge and found something remarkable, a narrow ledge system that traversed across the cliff face. It was barely 3 feet wide and covered with snow, but it appeared to lead around the cliff band to a section where the slope resumed at a manageable angle. "It's risky," Tom said, "but it might be our only option." Marcus examined the ledge traverse. It would require them to essentially walk along a narrow shelf with a potentially fatal drop on one side. In good conditions with proper safety equipment, it would be a challenging but manageable route. In a blizzard, while carrying an unconscious person, it was nearly suicidal. But staying where they were was definitely suicidal. And going back up the slope was probably beyond their physical capabilities at this point. "I'll go first," Marcus decided. "Test the route and see if it's stable. Marcus, if you fall, if I don't try, we all die here anyway." Marcus began the traverse, moving with extreme care along the narrow ledge. Each step had to be tested before committing his full weight, and the snow made it difficult to determine where the solid rock ended and empty space began. The ledge was worse than it had appeared from a distance. In several places, it narrowed to less than 2 feet, forcing Marcus to face the cliff wall and essentially shuffle sideways while carrying Sarah. The exposure was terrifying. One wrong step would mean a fall that would certainly kill both of them. Halfway across the traverse, Marcus encountered a section where the ledge had partially collapsed, leaving a gap of about 4 feet. In normal circumstances, it would have been an easy step across. Carrying Sarah, with his balance compromised by exhaustion and hypothermia, it seemed impossible. "There's a gap," Marcus called back to Tom. "I'm going to have to jump it." "Don't, but..." Marcus had already made the decision. Standing still on the exposed ledge was just as dangerous as moving forward. He gathered himself, calculated the distance, and leaped across the gap. His landing was awkward, but solid. Sarah's weight had nearly thrown him off balance, but he managed to stay on the ledge and continue the traverse. Behind him, Tom made the same jump with less difficulty, his lighter weight making the move more manageable. The far end of the ledge brought them to a steep but navigable slope that led down into what appeared to be a sheltered valley. For the first time in hours, Marcus felt a spark of hope. The terrain ahead looked familiar, and he thought he recognized the general shape of the valley as one that would lead them toward the emergency shelter. As they descended into the valley, the wind intensity decreased noticeably. They were still in the middle of a blizzard, but the valley walls provided some protection from the worst of the storm. More importantly, the temperature seemed slightly warmer at the lower elevation. Tom was showing signs of severe exhaustion, stumbling frequently and having difficulty maintaining his balance. The prolonged exposure to extreme cold was taking its toll on all of them, but Tom had been pushing himself beyond his limits for hours. How much further? Tom asked, his voice slurred with fatigue. Marcus consulted his compass and tried to match their position with his mental map of the area. Maybe a mile, maybe less. The shelter should be at the head of this valley. But as they continued down the valley, Marcus began to have doubts. The terrain wasn't quite matching his expectations, and he was starting to worry that they had descended into the wrong drainage. If they were in the wrong valley, they could wander for hours without finding the shelter. That's when they saw the light. It was just a faint glow through the blowing snow, but it was definitely artificial light. The emergency shelter was equipped with solar panels and LED lights that would automatically activate in low light conditions. There, Marcus pointed toward the light. That's it. That's the shelter. The final approach to the emergency hut was the longest quarter-mile of Marcus's life. Each step was an effort of will, and Sarah seemed to be getting heavier with every yard. But the light was getting brighter, and soon they could make out the distinctive shape of the emergency shelter, a small, insulated building designed to provide refuge for stranded climbers and hikers. Tom reached the door first and fumbled with the latch, his frostbitten hands barely able to manipulate the mechanism. The door swung open, revealing warmth, light, and safety. Marcus carried Sarah inside and gently lowered her to one of the emergency cots. For the first time in over 8 hours, she was out of the storm, in a heated environment, with access to proper medical supplies and communication equipment. But as Marcus began checking her vital signs, he realized that reaching the shelter might have been too late. Sarah's pulse was barely detectable. Her breathing was extremely shallow, and her skin had taken on the grayish color that indicated severe hypothermia. They had carried her 20 miles through impossible conditions, but the question now was whether she would survive long enough for rescue to arrive. The emergency shelter's automated systems hummed to life as Marcus and Tom collapsed inside, their bodies finally registering the warmth after hours of brutal cold. But there was no time for relief. Sarah lay motionless on the emergency cot, her breathing so shallow that Marcus had to put his ear to her chest to confirm she was still alive. "Tom, get the communication equipment working," Marcus ordered, already diving into the shelter's medical supplies. "We need emergency evacuation now." The shelter was well stocked with advanced emergency gear, oxygen tanks, 4 fluids, cardiac monitoring equipment, and medications that could stabilize hypothermia victims. But Marcus quickly realized that Sarah's condition was beyond what even these supplies could handle. Her core temperature had dropped so low that aggressive rewarming could trigger cardiac arrest. Tom fumbled with the satellite communication system, his frostbitten fingers struggling with the control buttons. The device powered up, but the storm was interfering with the satellite signal, creating static and dropouts that made communication nearly impossible. "I'm getting through, but it's broken up," Tom reported. "Something about ... helicopter ... weather. Can't make out the details." Marcus began the delicate process of trying to stabilize Sarah without killing her. He started supplemental oxygen and began passive rewarming techniques, using the shelter's heating system and insulated blankets to gradually raise her body temperature. Too fast, and her heart could stop. Too slow, and her organs would shut down from the cold. Sarah's pulse was irregular and getting weaker. Marcus attached the cardiac monitor from the medical kit and was alarmed by what he saw. Her heart rhythm showed signs of severe hypothermia-induced dysfunction. She was entering the final stages of hypothermia, where the body begins shutting down non-essential functions to preserve the brain and heart. "Talk to me, Sarah," Marcus said, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "You've made it this far. Don't quit on me now." Tom finally managed to establish clear communication with the Rescue Coordination Center. The news wasn't good. "They can't fly in these conditions," Tom reported grimly. "Wind speeds are over 70 miles per hour with zero visibility. The earliest possible helicopter evacuation is at dawn, assuming the storm clears." Marcus checked his watch. Dawn was still 5 hours away. Sarah didn't have 5 hours. "What about ground evacuation?" "They're assembling a team, but it'll take them at least 6 hours to reach us in these conditions. They're bringing a medical team and specialized cold weather gear." 6 hours. Marcus looked at Sarah's deteriorating vital signs and knew she wouldn't last that long without more aggressive intervention than he could provide in the emergency shelter. That's when Marcus made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. "We're not waiting," he announced. "Marcus, what are you talking about?" "We made it to the shelter. We're safe." "She's not safe. Look at her." Marcus gestured to the cardiac monitor, which was showing increasingly erratic heart rhythms. "She's dying right now." "The shelter bought us time, but not enough time. What are you suggesting?" Marcus was already checking the shelter's equipment inventory, looking for anything that could help them move Sarah more effectively. "There's a trail from here that leads directly to the valley floor. It's only 4 miles, and it's all downhill. If we can get her to the main road, we can meet the ground team halfway." Tom stared at Marcus as if he had lost his mind. "You want to go back out into that storm after what we just went through?" "I want to save her life. The medical team can't get to us fast enough, but we can get to them." "Marcus, we're all at the edge of hypothermia ourselves. You've been carrying her for hours. Your body can't take much more." Marcus was already repacking the medical supplies and preparing Sarah for transport. "Then it's a good thing we only have 4 miles to go." The truth was that Marcus could feel his body beginning to shut down. The prolonged exposure, the physical exertion of carrying Sarah, and the stress of navigating in impossible conditions had pushed him beyond normal human limits. But something deeper than physical strength was driving him now. Elena's face appeared in his mind, not the wasted, cancer-ravaged woman from the hospital, but the vibrant, fearless person who had made him promise to never stop being the man who helped others. This was what that promise meant. Not just helping when it was convenient or safe, but helping when it meant risking everything. The emergency shelter had a specialized rescue sled designed for evacuating injured persons in winter conditions. It was lightweight but strong, with runners that would glide over snow and secure restraints to keep the patient stable during transport. Marcus began transferring Sarah to the sled, carefully securing her with the provided straps and surrounding her with all available insulation. The sled's design would allow him to pull her rather than carry her, distributing the weight more efficiently and potentially making the journey possible. "If we do this," Tom said quietly, "and we get caught in the open when our strength gives out, we all die. You understand that?" "If we don't do this, she dies for certain," Marcus replied. "I can live with the risk. I can't live with not trying." Tom was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with the decision. Finally, he began putting on his gear again. 4 miles, 4 miles. "And you're sure about the route?" "I've hiked it dozens of times. It's a maintained trail, well marked. Even in this storm, we should be able to follow it." They spent 20 minutes preparing for what would be their final push to save Sarah's life. The sled was loaded with medical supplies, emergency gear, and enough food and water for the journey. Marcus rigged a harness system that would allow him to pull the sled efficiently while Tom navigated and provided support. Before they left the shelter, Marcus used the communication system to update the Rescue Coordination Center on their plan. The response was immediate and predictable. Negative, do not attempt evacuation. Repeat, do not leave the shelter. Conditions are too dangerous for travel. Marcus keyed the microphone one final time. Sarah Chun will not survive until dawn. We are proceeding with emergency evacuation to meet your ground team. Ada to valley floor, approximately 3 hours. He switched off the communication system. Before they could respond, the trail from the emergency shelter was indeed well maintained and clearly marked, but the storm had transformed it into something barely recognizable. Snow had drifted across the path in places, creating obstacles that required careful navigation. The sled performed better than Marcus had hoped, gliding smoothly over most surfaces, but it was still a significant physical challenge to pull it. While maintaining balance on the steep, icy trail, Tom took the lead, using his headlamp to identify the trail markers and navigate around obstacles. The downhill grade made progress relatively fast, but it also made controlling the sled's descent more difficult. Several times, Marcus had to use his ice axe as a brake to prevent the sled from running away on steep sections. 1 mile into the descent, they encountered their first major obstacle. A large tree had fallen across the trail, its massive trunk creating a barrier that was too high to pull the sled over and too long to easily go around. "We'll have to lift her over," Tom said, examining the fallen tree. It was a complex operation. They had to carefully remove Sarah from the sled, carry her over the obstacle, then maneuver the empty sled across before reloading her. The entire process took nearly 30 minutes and exhausted both men, but they managed it without incident. 2 miles down, Sarah's condition began to change. Her breathing became more regular and her pulse strengthened slightly. The passive rewarming from the emergency shelter, combined with the insulation in the sled, was having a positive effect. "She's responding," Marcus said during a brief rest stop. "Her core temperature is coming up." But the improvement was slow, and Marcus knew they were still in a race against time. Hypothermia could have lasting effects even if the victim survived. Brain damage, kidney failure, cardiac complications. The sooner they could get Sarah to a proper medical facility, the better her chances of a full recovery. The trail began to level out as they approached the valley floor, but the terrain became more technical. They had to navigate through a series of stream crossings and rocky sections that required careful sled handling. The storm was still raging, but the wind was less intense at the lower elevation. 3 miles from the shelter, Tom spotted lights. In the distance, the search and rescue team's vehicles on the main road. "There they are," Tom shouted over the wind. "We made it." But they still had a mile to go, and that final mile proved to be the most challenging. The trail crossed several open meadows where the wind exposure was severe, and the snow was deep. Enough to make pulling the sled extremely difficult. Marcus was operating on pure willpower now. His body had given everything it had hours ago, and he was running on reserves he didn't know existed. Each step was a conscious decision to keep moving, to keep pulling, to keep fighting for Sarah's life. Tom wasn't in much better condition. His earlier hypothermia had left him weak and disoriented, and he was stumbling frequently. But he stayed, with Marcus providing encouragement and support when the task seemed impossible. The lights on the road grew brighter and more distinct. Marcus could see multiple vehicles and figures moving around them. The full search and rescue response was waiting for them. With 200 yards to go, Marcus's legs gave out completely. He collapsed in the snow, his body finally admitting defeat. But Tom was there immediately, helping him to his feet. "Come on, partner, 200 yards. We can crawl that far if we have to." Together, they covered the final distance. The rescue team met them 50 yards from the road. taking over Sarah's care and helping both Marcus and Tom to the waiting vehicles. Sarah was transferred to an advanced life support ambulance within minutes of reaching the road. The paramedics immediately began aggressive, rewarming procedures and cardiac support while racing toward the nearest trauma center. Marcus watched the ambulance disappear into the storm, its lights fading into the swirling snow. He had carried Sarah Chun 20 miles through conditions that should have killed them all. Whether it had been enough remained to be seen. 3 days later, Marcus received a phone call at his cabin. Sarah Chun was awake, alert, and expected to make a full recovery. She had suffered some frostbite damage to her toes and fingers, but there was no brain damage or permanent organ dysfunction. "She wants to see you," the doctor said. "She says she has something to tell you." When Marcus arrived at the hospital, he found Sarah sitting up in bed, looking remarkably well considering her ordeal. Her first words surprised him. "You kept your promise," she said. "What promise?" "To your wife, Alina. You told me about her during one of the times I was conscious. About the promise you made to never stop helping people who needed it." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't sure you could hear me." "I heard more than you think. And I want you to know that promise saved my life. Not just because you carried me through that storm, but because you gave me a reason to keep fighting. When it would have been easier to give up, I remembered what you said about promises being worth keeping no matter what they cost." Sarah reached for his hand. "Alina would be proud of you." Marcus felt tears freezing on his cheeks as he walked back to his truck. The promise he had made to his dying wife 8 years ago had indeed been kept. And in keeping it, he had discovered that some things, like human decency, compassion, and the refusal to abandon others in their darkest hour, are worth any price. The storm had ended, but the memory of what people could accomplish when they refused to give up would last forever. While Marcus and Tom were making their desperate final push to save Sarah, Jessica Martinez was fighting her own battle for survival in the granite crevice they had left behind. The emergency beacon sat beside her, its red light blinking steadily. But the storm was still too intense for any rescue aircraft to reach her position. Jessica knew she was in serious trouble. The frostbite in her hands had progressed beyond the superficial stages, and she could feel the numbness spreading up her fingers toward her palms. Without proper medical treatment, she would lose parts of multiple fingers, possibly her entire hands if the damage continued. But that wasn't her most immediate concern. The crevice shelter that had seemed like salvation when they first found it was becoming a trap. Snow was accumulating at the entrance, gradually sealing her inside what could become her tomb. Every hour, Jessica had to dig herself out, using her damaged hands to clear away snow that threatened to bury her completely. Each time became more difficult as her fine motor control deteriorated, and the pain in her frostbitten extremities became excruciating. The emergency beacon was her lifeline, but it was also a source of torment. She could hear occasional radio chatter through its speaker, search and rescue teams coordinating, weather reports, updates on Marcus and Tom's progress. But she couldn't communicate back. The beacon was transmit only, designed to guide rescuers to her location, not to provide two-way communication. Through the static and wind noise, she caught fragments of conversation that told her Marcus had reached the emergency shelter with Sarah. Relief flooded through her. They had made it. But that relief was tempered by the knowledge that she was still trapped, possibly for many more hours. As the night wore on, Jessica began to experience the psychological effects of prolonged isolation in extreme conditions. The constant wind created auditory hallucinations. She kept hearing voices calling her name, footsteps approaching, the sound of rescue helicopters that never materialized. The cold was becoming more aggressive. Despite her emergency bivvy and the shelter provided by the rock crevice, Jessica could feel her core temperature beginning to drop. She recognized the early signs of hypothermia from her medical training: confusion, Drowsiness, the paradoxical feeling of warmth that preceded the final stages. She forced herself to stay active, doing isometric exercises in the confined space, but her energy reserves were limited. She had shared most of her food with the group before they separated, keeping only emergency rations that would last perhaps another day. Around 3 a.m., Jessica made a discovery that changed her situation dramatically. While shifting position to maintain circulation, her hand touched something unexpected in the back of the crevice, an opening that led deeper into the rock formation. Using her headlamp to investigate, Jessica found that the crevice extended much further back than they had realized. More importantly, the deeper section was completely protected from the wind and significantly warmer. It was like finding a natural cave system hidden within the granite. The decision to move deeper into the crevice was risky. If the opening collapsed, or if she became lost in the rock maze, she would be impossible to find even when rescue teams arrived. But staying in the outer section meant continued exposure to deadly cold and the constant threat of being buried by snow. Jessica carefully gathered her gear and worked her way deeper into the crevice. The passage was narrow, requiring her to crawl in places, and her damaged hands made the movement painful and clumsy. But as she went deeper, the temperature rose noticeably, and the sound of the wind faded to a distant whisper. 20 feet into the passage, it opened into a small chamber about the size of a closet. The space was completely dry and protected, with a relatively flat floor where she could set up her emergency shelter properly. For the first time in hours, Jessica felt like she might actually survive the night. She activated a chemical heat pack and used it to begin the process of rewarming her hands. The returning circulation was agony. Her fingertips felt like they were being stabbed with hot needles, but it was a good sign. Pain meant the tissue was still alive. The natural shelter allowed Jessica to rest properly for the first time since the rescue began. She managed to sleep fitfully for a few hours, waking periodically to check the emergency beacon and ensure it was still transmitting. Dawn brought new challenges. The storm had finally begun to weaken, but Jessica faced a difficult decision. The emergency beacon was still outside in the main crevice, and she needed to stay close to it so rescue teams could find her. But the outer section remained dangerously cold, and her condition was still precarious. She compromised by moving back and forth between the two areas, spending time in the deeper chamber to stay warm, then returning to the beacon location to maintain her rescue signal and watch for incoming aircraft. Around 8 a.m., Jessica heard something that made her heart race, the distinctive sound of a helicopter approaching. She scrambled to the crevice entrance, waving her arms and activating her emergency strobe light. But the helicopter passed overhead without stopping. The pilot couldn't see her in the narrow crevice, and the terrain was too dangerous for a landing. Even if they had spotted her, the near miss with rescue was devastating psychologically. Jessica had built up her hopes, only to have them crushed when the aircraft disappeared over the ridge. She realized that even though the storm was weakening, her rescue was far from certain. She needed to make herself more visible. Using her remaining energy, Jessica began the dangerous process of climbing out of the crevice to higher ground where she could be seen from the air. It was a calculated risk. Leaving the protection of the crevice exposed her to the elements again, but staying hidden meant she might never be found. The climb out of the crevice was the most difficult thing she had ever attempted. Her hands were barely functional, making it nearly impossible to grip the rock hold securely. Several times she nearly fell, saved only by luck and desperation. When she finally reached the surface, Jessica found herself in a transformed landscape. Storm had deposited several feet of new snow, and the familiar terrain was completely unrecognizable. Worse, the wind was still strong enough to knock her down, and her exposed position made hypothermia an immediate threat. But she could see for miles in every direction, and more importantly, she could be seen. Jessica activated every signaling device she had, emergency strobe, signal mirror, brightly colored fabric that she tied to her ice axe like a flag. Then she began the process of creating a visible signal that would attract aerial rescuers, using her ice axe. And what little strength remained, Jessica began tramping out a large X in the snow, the international distress signal. It was exhausting work, but each step made the signal more visible from above. She had just completed the signal when she heard it again, the sound of an approaching helicopter. This time, the aircraft was flying a systematic search pattern, and Jessica could see the rescue crew scanning the terrain below. She waved frantically, activated her strobe light, and used her signal mirror to flash reflected sunlight toward the aircraft. For several agonizing minutes, the helicopter continued its search pattern without seeming to notice her. Then it turned. Helicopter banked sharply and headed directly toward her position. Jessica felt tears of relief freezing on her cheeks as the aircraft circled her location, the crew clearly having spotted her distress signals. But her ordeal wasn't over yet. The terrain was too steep and unstable for the helicopter to land directly. Instead, the crew deployed a rescue specialist on a long line, a dangerous operation in the gusty wind conditions. The rescue specialist, an experienced mountain rescue technician named Rodriguez, reached Jessica's position after a harrowing descent from the hovering aircraft. His first words were about the others. "Are you Jessica Martinez? Where are the rest of your team?" "Marcus and Tom got Sarah to the emergency shelter," Jessica shouted over the helicopter noise. "They should be safe." "They're not at the shelter. The facility is empty." Jessica felt her heart sink. If Marcus and Tom weren't at the emergency shelter, what had happened to them? Had they died attempting to save Sarah? Had her sacrifice been meaningless? Rodriguez quickly assessed Jessica's condition and began preparing her for evacuation. Her hands would require immediate medical attention, and her core temperature was dangerously low, but she was stable enough for transport. The helicopter extraction was terrifying. Jessica was secured in a rescue harness and lifted through space. On a cable, spinning and swaying in the wind while the ground fell away below. But within minutes, she was inside the warm cabin of the rescue aircraft, wrapped in emergency blankets and receiving medical care. As the helicopter flew toward the hospital, Jessica learned the rest of the story from the rescue crew. Marcus and Tom had indeed left the emergency shelter, attempting to evacuate Sarah by sled to meet ground rescue teams. They had succeeded, reaching the valley floor just hours before Jessica's own rescue. Sarah was alive and recovering. Tom was being treated for severe hypothermia and frostbite. Marcus was in exhaustion and exposure, but stable. All 4 members of the original rescue had survived against odds that seemed impossible. At the hospital, Jessica underwent immediate surgery to address the frostbite damage to her hands. The doctors were able to save most of her fingers, though she would lose parts of 3 fingertips and require months of rehabilitation to regain full function. But she was alive, and so were the others. During her recovery, Jessica had time to reflect on the experience that had nearly killed them all. She thought about the decisions that had saved their lives. Marcus's refusal to abandon Sarah, Tom's courage during the technical climbing, her own choice to activate the beacon and create visible distress signals. Most of all, she thought about the power of human connection in the face of impossible odds. They had all survived because they had refused to abandon each other, even when doing so would have been the rational choice. 3 weeks after the rescue, Jessica received a visitor in her hospital room. Sarah Chun, still moving slowly but clearly, recovering, had come to thank her. "You saved all our lives," Sarah said. "If you hadn't activated that beacon, if you hadn't guided the rescue teams to our area, they never would have found us in time." Jessica looked at her bandaged hands, thinking of the price they had all paid. We saved each other. That's what people do. It was a lesson that would stay with all of them for the rest of their lives. That survival isn't just about individual strength or skill. but about the willingness to risk everything for others, even when the odds seem hopeless. The mountain had tested them all, and somehow, against all odds, they had passed. 6 months after the rescue, the small mountain town of Cedar Falls was hosting something unprecedented, a public hearing to determine whether Marcus Hayes should face criminal charges for reckless endangerment. The case had drawn national attention, dividing people into camps, those who saw him as a hero, and those who believed his actions had unnecessarily risked multiple lives. District Attorney Catherine Walsh sat across from Marcus in the packed courthouse, her files spread before her like weapons. She had built her career on prosecuting cases where good intentions led to tragic outcomes, and she saw Marcus's rescue attempt as a textbook example of dangerous vigilantism. "Mr. Hayes," Walsh began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never doubted her own moral certainty, "you made a decision to ignore direct orders from rescue coordination, to leave a position of relative safety, and to drag 3 injured people through conditions that meteorologists described as unsurvivable. How do you justify those actions?" Marcus looked around the courtroom, seeing familiar faces and strangers alike. Sarah Chun sat in the front row, her hands still showing the pale scars of frostbite, but her eyes clear and determined. Tom Rodriguez was beside her, walking with a slight limp that would be permanent, but otherwise fully recovered. Jessica Martinez sat further back, her partial finger amputations hidden beneath thin gloves, but her presence a testament to her own survival. "I justified them the same way I justify them now," Marcus replied quietly. "People were dying, and I had the skills to help them. That's not a choice, it's an obligation." Walsh pulled out a thick folder of documents. "Let's examine the consequences of your obligation. Mr. Hayes, the initial rescue team lost 2 members, Rodriguez and Patterson, who died in an avalanche while attempting to reach Dr. Chun. Your unauthorized rescue attempt resulted in severe injuries to 3 people. Massive resource expenditure by emergency services, and put multiple rescue personnel at risk during the storm. Rodriguez and Patterson died before I even reached the scene," Marcus responded. "They were trying to save Sarah Chun's life, just like I was. Their deaths are tragic, but they're not the result of my actions. But your actions prolonged the emergency situation. Ms. Martinez required multiple surgeries and will have permanent disability. Mr. Rodriguez suffered severe hypothermia that could have caused permanent organ damage. Dr. Chun herself was minutes from death when you reached the valley floor. How is that a successful rescue?" Dr. Richard Henley, the trauma surgeon who had treated Sarah, stood up from the gallery. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Judge Patricia Morgan, a weathered woman who had presided over mountain country disputes for 20 years, nodded. "Dr. Henley, you may address the court. I've practiced emergency medicine for 15 years, and I've seen hundreds of hypothermia cases. Dr. Chun's survival is medically unprecedented. Her core temperature when she reached our emergency room was 78 degrees Fahrenheit. The literature says that's incompatible with life. She survived because Mr. Hayes got her to us in time, and because his field treatment during the evacuation was flawless." Walsh wasn't deterred. "Dr. Henley, isn't it true that if Mr. Hayes had simply waited for the storm to pass and professional rescue teams to reach them, the outcome might have been better for everyone involved?" "No, it's not true. Dr. Chun would have died. Her hypothermia was advancing too rapidly. Even in the emergency shelter, without active rewarming and medical intervention, she had perhaps 2 hours of life remaining. Mr. Hayes' decision to transport her wasn't reckless. It was the only medically sound option." The hearing continued for 3 days, with testimony from meteorologists who described the storm as a once-in-a-decade event, from rescue professionals who spoke about the impossible conditions Marcus had navigated, and from the survivors themselves. When Sarah took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. "Miss Chun," Walsh began, You told Mr. Hayes to leave you to die, repeatedly. Yet he ignored your wishes and put others at risk to save your life. How do you feel about that decision now? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. When I told Marcus to leave me, I wasn't making a rational decision. I was dying. Hypothermia affects judgment and reasoning. I was essentially asking him to participate in my suicide. But you were competent to make medical decisions. About your own care. No, I wasn't. That's the point. Marcus recognized that my request wasn't coming from a place of sound judgment, but from despair and physical deterioration. He saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself, the will to live. Walsh pressed harder. But surely you understand that his decision to carry you 20 miles through that storm could have resulted in all 4 of you dying instead of just you. Sarah's response surprised everyone in the courtroom. I've spent the last 6 months studying the meteorological data from that night, the terrain maps, the recorded radio communications. I'm a scientist and I wanted to understand exactly what Marcus had accomplished. She pulled out a thick folder of her own. The storm that night produced wind speeds of up to 85 miles per hour, with temperatures dropping to -15 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind chill factor reached -60 degrees. The snowfall rate was 3 inches per hour, with 0 visibility for sustained periods. Sarah looked directly at Walsh. In those conditions, Marcus Hayes navigated 15 miles of technical mountain terrain while carrying an unconscious person, then made a technical rock climbing ascent, then traversed a cliff face, then descended 4 miles while pulling a rescue sled. The statistical probability of completing that journey successfully was less than 1%. Exactly my point, Walsh said. He attempted something with a 99% chance of failure. No, Sarah replied firmly. He attempted something with a 99% chance of all of us dying versus a 100% chance of me dying if he did nothing. From a purely mathematical standpoint, his decision was not only rational, it was the only logical choice. The most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Elena Hayes' sister, Maria Santos, had flown in from California to testify about the promise Marcus had made to his dying wife. Elena made Marcus promise to never stop helping people who needed it, Maria told the court. She was terrified that losing her would make him withdraw from the world, become someone smaller and more cautious. That promise wasn't about reckless heroism. It was about maintaining his humanity in the face of loss. Judge Morgan leaned forward. Ms. Santos, how does that relate to the charges against your brother-in-law? Because Elena understood something that this court seems to be struggling with. There are moments in life where the safe choice and the right choice are not the same thing. Elena was asking Marcus to always choose what was right, even when it was dangerous. On the final day of testimony, Marcus himself took the stand. Walsh had saved her most aggressive questioning for last, clearly hoping to break down his composure and reveal what she believed was dangerous recklessness disguised as heroism. Mr. Hayes, do you believe you're above the law? Above the authority of rescue coordination and emergency services? No, I believe I'm responsible for my own actions and their consequences, even when those actions directly violate orders from legitimate authorities. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. I've spent 8 years working search and rescue in these mountains. I've followed orders, I've worked within the system, and I've saved a lot of lives doing it. But that night, the system couldn't save Sarah Chun. The weather was too severe, the distance too great, the time too short. So you decided to become a one-man rescue operation? I decided to honor the promise I made to my wife, and to do what I believed was right. If that makes me guilty of something, then I'm guilty. Walsh leaned forward. What if you had been wrong? What if your assessment of the situation had been incorrect, and all 4 of you had died as a result of your decision? Then I would have died trying to save someone who needed help. I can live with that outcome better than I could live with not trying at all." The courtroom was silent as Walsh returned to her seat. She had expected to find arrogance or recklessness in Marcus's testimony, but instead had encountered something more difficult to prosecute: a man who had made an impossible choice based on principles that most people could only aspire to. Judge Morgan recessed the court for deliberation, but her decision came just 2 hours later. This court finds that while Mr. Hayes's actions during the rescue were technically in violation of emergency services protocols, they were motivated by reasonable concern for human life and executed with skill and judgment that ultimately prevented what would have been a certain fatality. She looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Hayes, the law exists to provide order and safety to society. But the law also recognizes that there are times when extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary responses. Your actions that night fell into that category. The charges of reckless endangerment are dismissed. However, this court strongly recommends that emergency services protocols be reviewed to better accommodate situations where local knowledge and individual initiative might be necessary to save lives." As people filed out of the courtroom, Sarah approached Marcus one final time. "I have something for you," she said, handing him a small package. Inside was a simple compass, engraved with the words, "For finding the right direction when the way forward isn't clear." "Elena would have been proud," Sarah added softly. Marcus looked at the compass, thinking of the promise he had made 8 years ago and the choice he had faced that night in the storm. The legal battle was over, but the deeper questions it had raised would stay with him forever. Sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules. Sometimes saving a life meant risking everything. And sometimes the most important promises were the ones that cost the most to keep. The mountains had taught him that lesson. The courtroom had confirmed it. And Elena's memory would always remind him that being human meant choosing love over safety, courage over caution, and hope over the certainty of loss. 2 years after the rescue that changed everything, Marcus Hayes stood at the edge of Devil's Ridge, watching the sunrise paint the Cascade Mountains in shades of gold and crimson. But he wasn't alone this time. Behind him, a group of 12 people adjusted their packs and checked their gear, preparing for what would be the most meaningful hike of their lives. Sarah Chun secured the last buckle on her backpack, her movements confident despite the permanent scars that marked her fingers. The research biochemist had become something she never expected, a wilderness advocate, using her scientific background to study and promote mountain safety protocols. "Ready for this?" she asked Marcus, her breath visible in the cold mountain air. "I've been ready for 2 years," Marcus replied. The group they were leading wasn't ordinary hikers. These were the families of Rodriguez and Patterson, the 2 search and rescue technicians who had died in the avalanche during the original rescue attempt. Their widows, children, and parents had asked Marcus to guide them to the place where their loved ones had made the ultimate sacrifice. Carmen Rodriguez walked beside her teenage son Miguel, carrying a small bronze plaque they would install at the site. Elena Patterson, 8 months pregnant when her husband died, now held the hand of her 2-year-old daughter Ana, who would never remember the father who died trying to save a stranger. Tom Rodriguez, no relation to the fallen rescuer despite sharing a name, had volunteered to help guide the memorial hike. His recovery from the rescue had been remarkable, though he still favored his left leg on steep terrain. He had left search and rescue work, becoming instead a mountain safety instructor, teaching others how to survive the conditions that had nearly killed them all. Jessica Martinez brought up the rear of the group, her modified hiking gloves hiding the permanent damage to her hands. She had returned to her medical practice, but with a specialization that surprised her colleagues. She had become an expert in cold weather injuries and survival medicine, publishing papers that were now standard reading in emergency medical training. The hike to the memorial site took them along the same route Marcus had traveled that terrible night, but in daylight and good weather, it told a different story. What had been a nightmare landscape of wind and snow was revealed as some of the most beautiful terrain in North America. As they walked, Marcus found himself thinking about the changes the rescue had brought to his life. The legal proceedings had ended in his favor, but the real transformation had been deeper and more personal. He had started the Marcus Hayes Wilderness Education Foundation, using the insurance settlement from Elena's death to teach survival skills and mountain safety to anyone who wanted to learn. "Dad, tell me again about why Uncle James did this job," Miguel Rodriguez said to his mother as they paused at a scenic overlook. Carmen Rodriguez had struggled with her husband's death, not understanding why he had chosen a profession that ultimately killed him. But 2 years of grief counseling and connecting with other rescue families had given her perspective. "Your father believed that mountains bring out both the best and worst in people," she explained to her son. "He wanted to be there for the moments when people needed their best selves to survive." The group reached the avalanche site by mid-morning. The scar on the mountainside was still visible, a wide swath where tons of snow and ice had swept away everything in their path, including 2 men who had been trying to save a life. Marcus helped them set up the memorial plaque on a boulder that had been too large for the avalanche to move. The bronze inscription read simply, "James Rodriguez and Michael Patterson gave their lives in service to others. Their courage echoes in these mountains forever." But the memorial ceremony took an unexpected turn when Elena Patterson's 2-year-old daughter Anna broke away from her mother and walked directly to Marcus. She looked up at him with the same fearless eyes her father had possessed and said her first complete sentence. "Daddy helped people." Marcus knelt down to Anna's level, his own eyes filling with tears. "Yes, sweetheart. Your daddy helped people. He was very brave. Like you?" Anna asked with the directness that only children possess. Marcus looked around at the faces surrounding him, the families of the dead, the survivors of that terrible night, the friends who had supported him through the legal battles and media attention. He thought about Elena's promise, about the choice between safety and service, about what it meant to honor the dead by living fully. "I try to be," he told Anna. "We all try to be." The memorial service was led by Father Michael Santos, Maria Santos's husband, and Elena's brother-in-law. He spoke about sacrifice and service, about the courage to help strangers, and about how love transcends even death. "James and Michael died doing what they believed was right," Father Santos said. "They didn't die in vain because their example lives on in everyone who chooses to help others, even when it's dangerous, even when it's difficult, even when the outcome is uncertain." After the formal ceremony, the group dispersed to explore the area and reflect privately. Sarah found herself standing with Marcus at the exact spot where he had first heard her voice calling for help 2 years earlier. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Everything that happened, all the consequences?" Marcus was quiet for a long time, looking out over the landscape that had nearly killed them all. "I regret that Rodriguez and Patterson died. I regret that Jessica lost parts of her fingers. I regret that Tom will always walk with a limp. I regret that their families had to suffer. But I don't regret trying to save your life. I don't regret keeping the promise I made to Elena. And I don't regret learning that some things are worth any risk." Sarah nodded, understanding. "I've been thinking about something you said that night, when I asked you to leave me to die. You said that's what people do. When someone needs help, you help them, no matter what it costs." "I remember. I think you were wrong about that. Most people don't do that. Most people make rational decisions based on acceptable risk and reasonable odds. What you did wasn't what people do, it was what people should do. There's a difference." As the day progressed, the memorial hike became something unexpected, a celebration of life rather than just a remembrance of death. Miguel Rodriguez, now 16, had inherited his father's love of the mountains and announced his intention to pursue wilderness medicine as a career. Elena Patterson spoke about establishing a scholarship fund for children of fallen rescue workers. Tom Rodriguez shared stories about the new safety protocols that had been developed based on lessons learned from their rescue. GPS beacons were now standard equipment for all rescue teams. Communication systems had been upgraded, and weather monitoring had been improved to prevent teams from being caught in dangerous conditions. Jessica Martinez announced that she was writing a book about the medical aspects of their survival, focusing on how ordinary people could recognize and treat hypothermia and frostbite in emergency situations. The book would be dedicated to Rodriguez and Patterson, with proceeds supporting wilderness safety education. As the group prepared to head back down the mountain, Marcus made an announcement that surprised everyone. "This will be my last commercial guiding trip," he said. "I'm transitioning the foundation to full-time work, focusing on training and education rather than guided tours." "Why?" Carmen Rodriguez asked. Marcus looked around at the group, survivors, family members, friends who had become extended family through shared tragedy and triumph. "Because I've learned that the most important journeys aren't the ones you guide people through the mountains. They're the ones you help people take through life." The hike down was different from the ascent. The weight of memory and grief that had accompanied them up the mountain had been transformed into something lighter but no less meaningful: acceptance, purpose, and hope. As they reached the trailhead parking area, Anna Patterson ran ahead to the memorial stone that had been installed there the previous year. It listed the names of all the mountain rescue workers who had died in the line of duty over the past century, including her father and Rodriguez. She traced her father's name with her tiny finger, then looked back at Marcus. "Will you tell me more stories about Daddy?" "Every time you want to hear them," Marcus promised. That evening, the group gathered at Marcus's cabin for a dinner that had become an annual tradition. The walls were lined with photographs from various rescues, maps of the local mountains, and letters from people whose lives had been saved by the search and rescue teams over the years. But the centerpiece of the room was a simple photograph of Elena Hayes, taken during her last healthy summer, standing on a mountain peak with her arms spread wide, embracing the sky. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Sarah lingered behind to help Marcus clean up. "Elena would be proud of what you've built," she said, gesturing around the cabin that had become an informal headquarters for wilderness safety education. "I hope so. Sometimes I wonder if I'm honoring her memory or just trying to justify the risks I took that night. Maybe both. Maybe that's okay." Marcus smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought them all to this point. "You know what I've learned in the past 2 years?" "What?" "That the promise I made to Elena wasn't really about her. It was about me. About the kind of person I wanted to be. The kind of life I wanted to live. She just helped me see it clearly." Sarah nodded, understanding. "And what kind of person is that?" Marcus looked at the photograph of his wife, then out the window toward the mountains that had taken so much and given so much in return. "The kind who runs toward danger when people need help. The kind who keeps promises even when they're hard to keep. The kind who believes that some things, like human life, like love, like the courage to help strangers, are worth any risk." As Sarah drove away into the mountain night, Marcus stood on his porch looking up at the stars. Somewhere in those mountains, Rodriguez and Patterson were buried beneath tons of rock and ice, their sacrifice permanent and profound. Somewhere in the world, the people they had trained and inspired were continuing their work, carrying forward their example. And somewhere in his memory, Elena Hayes was still making him promise to never stop being the man who helped others, no matter what it cost. The mountains had taught him many things over the years, but the most important lesson was this: the choice between safety and service, between self-preservation and sacrifice, wasn't really a choice at all. It was a revelation of who you truly were when everything else was stripped away. Marcus Hayes had learned who he was during one terrible night in a blizzard, carrying a dying woman through impossible conditions because a promise made to another. Dying woman demanded it. He was a man who ran toward danger when people needed help. He was a man who kept his promises, and that knowledge, earned through suffering and loss and triumph, was worth every step of the 20-mile journey that had changed his life forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.